Good morning, and thank you for joining us for a virtual teach-in titled Keeping the Family Together, Digitizing Historic African American Cemeteries. I am Yamona Pierce, founder of the Hamilton Hood Foundation and host of this event. As many of you know, cemeteries are landscapes of celebration and places of memory. Therefore, it is important that the stories behind these sacred spaces can help deepen our understanding of who we are and where we come from, as well as the communities around them. That said, having a transformative approach to preserving these spaces should include education as well as preservation of history, which can be accomplished in many ways. Today, we have three disciplines: a genealogist, an anthropologist, and an archaeologist, here to speak to how we can accomplish preservation in this way. It is far too often that we have seen these sacred sites neglected and erased. Further, having this approach can foster community engagement and lessen the impact of development and encroachment. With no further ado, I introduce to you our three speakers and moderator today. And to conserve time, you may read each of their full bios in the chat box. You may also use the chat function during the event throughout this presentation to leave questions and comments. Our first speaker is Deborah Taylor Gonzalez. Deborah is a passionate genealogist. She has worked on her family's genealogy for over 30 years. She is president of Friends of Gear Cemetery and has been instrumental in the reformation of this organization since 2019. Welcome, Deborah. Our next speaker is Kaylee Hoyt. Kaylee Hoyt is a doctoral student from the University of South Florida's Anthropology Department, and she is the creative director of the Black Cemetery Network. Good morning and welcome, Kaylee. Our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Thaler. Dr. Thaler is a professor at Duke University. He's currently working as a lecturing fellow in the Thompson Writing Program at Duke University. And this semester, he has been teaching a course called The Anthropology of Durham, which students ask questions and explore the city's history and culture using data they collect from local cemeteries. And our moderator today is Celeste Keith. Celeste Keith is a 2021 fall intern with the Hamilton Hood Foundation. She will be checking the chat box throughout this event to take note of your comments and your questions. So without further ado, I welcome again Deborah Taylor Gonzalez. Deborah, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me get my presentation going. Okay, so I'm going to talk with you a bit about the genealogy of keeping the family together and sharing with you some ideas for identifying and digitalizing our burial ground residents. In a sense, who are they and how do we keep them hidden no longer? And the objectives I have or to share with you is one, preserving with dignity. Share with you some thoughts on getting started with cemetery preservation, utilizing our genealogy toolbox, and so some strategies on how we can locate and create that list of residents, and then preserving those legacies, developing stories and archiving suggestions. So let's get started. Preserving with dignity. So any group that is getting started, there's some things I suggest doing right away. We could go in, we can clean up the ground, we can make it look good, pat ourselves on the back, and then 10 years later, repeat. So this is what I kind of mean by preserving with dignity, in that we want it to be something that is long-term, that serves the cemetery through perpetuity. So in most states, there is a registration for these cemeteries that have been hidden, that are considered abandoned, to register with your state. They help to send up red flags for when there are constructions. Now, doesn't mean that it catches everything, but if there is such a site in your state, register it. We're going to also see some other ways that you can register the sites to make them known. Spend some time determining the legal status of the burial ground. Doesn't mean we have to solve the issue, but at least understand it, because as you move through this process, there are times you're going to make decisions, and knowing that legal status will help you. And as a part of that, you want to locate any deeds that were associated with the cemetery, and gather as many documents as you can to talk about how the cemetery was formed. Was it a committee? Was it a church? Exactly how the history started with the formation of the cemetery. And research it a bit more, understanding the community that it serves, because that will also, when we start to look at how to generate lists, it will help us with that. One of the things that what I've learned with Gear Cemetery that is very important is to very early on survey and document the current conditions. We lose so much sometimes through our other efforts and through nature and everything else, that it's important that we spend some time and just take a survey, because sometimes if you have to go back to repair something, you'll have those types of documents to help you later on. And then as an organization, you very early want to set your mission and your goals, so that people who are working with the organization, we all are following the same roadmap, we have the same mission, and we have the same goals. These are some of the things that will help in the long run as you get started. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of some of the genealogy toolkits. Toolbox. We have a toolbox, and you have tools. Like any profession, there's a toolbox, and you have all these tools. Now, there's no magic wand that I can share to help us find things really quickly. It's all a matter of time, and your toolbox, you build it slowly. The carpenter who starts out with the basic tools, and slowly he adds more tools. And that's the same way when we look at genealogy and how we go about studying and tracing our descendants, or not our ancestors. Sorry about that. So some of the things in the toolbox, or ways to find things in the toolbox, is to look at your community. There's lots of resources and records and things in our community. There's organizations you want to think about, definitely families, businesses, looking at technology such as websites and Facebook pages and things like that will also help. Special collections. And then also your current knowledge. The thing you kind of always really want to start with is what you already know. In fact, genealogists, we always start from the present to start to work backwards, or when we find things that will direct the method or way we want to go. But we kind of start with, it's best to start with what you know to begin with. So we're not going to be able to go through entire toolbox, but we're going to go through some of the things that are important, or that I found helpful as we've worked through with the Friends of Gear Cemetery. And that's not overwhelming. So records. Records are important. I look at them as they're the tracks of our lives. Everything we do, we are tracked by some type of record. Think about that grocery store receipt that you have, and then when you get those coupons and you're wondering, like, how did I know this is what I went by? Well, if you have one of those frequent shopper cards and you're using it, they're tracking you. Those are records. But there are some records in genealogy research that are important to start with, and one are vital records. And those include our death, divorce, marriage, and birth. So the last event in a person's life is our death. So our death record is the place we usually want to start and to look for somebody. There are also legal records. Another, what I call end of life records, are probates and wills, and they're worth looking at. I've made some of the broken some of the brick walls with my family with probate records. In government records, we all are aware of census records that are done every 10 years, but there are also sometimes state census records, but then there are other local records that are in our municipalities. And a lot of these local records were created even before things were done at the state and national level. So I'm going to share with you a few of some of these records, and looking specifically at a death record. So I have two death records here of a husband and a wife. And the thing I wanted to point out here is, if you look at the highlighted area and on the right death certificate, it says Henderson. This person did not die in the county, in Durham County. I'm in Durham County, North Carolina, and that's where we're doing our research for our cemetery. But the person was buried in the same cemetery as her husband, and her husband died in Clarkton. They're 150 miles apart, but they both are buried in a cemetery in Clarkton, North Carolina. Okay, so when we look at these death records, yes, our eyes automatically want to go down to the cemetery. But studying all this other information and understanding it will help us with knowing more about the people that we are trying to document and make hidden no more. Okay, this is an example of a city death record. It's out of Indiana, in Marion, Indiana. So here is where the municipality was keeping death information on its citizens. And some of these will go back further than the state. The other thing too with our death records is you have to kind of understand when they were started in your state. Every state is different. In North Carolina, 1913 was the year that death certificates were required by the state. But there, in some of the different counties, there are death records that are in the courthouses in those areas that are earlier than the date that the state was requiring death certificates. See, those are things we got to keep in mind as we move along. Okay, I'm going to back up a bit to census records. Well, we haven't got there yet. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, wills and probates. As I mentioned, those have been really important to me in terms of some of my research. And on the left is an example of a probate record out of Ohio. And on the right is example of a probate record or a document that was in a probate file for one of the people buried in Geer Cemetery. And this was a very exciting find for us because this particular person, her family brought a lawsuit against the distribution of her estate. So this probate file was like 30 pages long and had all kinds of things in it. And one of the things that was in there was this receipt, a receipt for a headstone for Olivia Wills. And why was this exciting to us? It was because this headstone was an example of a cement molded headstone. And we have lots of examples of those in Geer Cemetery. And we're finding that places where people did not have a lot of funds to buy the granite and the marble type of headstones, this was one of the ways that they could honor their deceased member and put a headstone with these concrete type of headstones. And we always thought that there was somebody locally doing these. And what we found through this receipt was a company that was doing it. So this has given us a little more insight into, our cemetery and places we can go and do research. Now, we haven't quite followed this one through. This was a fairly recent find, but it gives us this company, this Aiken Stone Company, and which is in South Carolina, and maybe, just maybe, there are records that still exist from that company that we might be able to go through and find other um, transactions that they had for Gear Cemetery. So I hope you're starting to see that this isn't a straight line, that there are going to be some really unique places to start to look for people that are buried within a burial grounds. Okay, census data. Now, census data is not going to tell us where people are buried, but when we get a little bit further in and we start to talk about looking at how we're going to keep the legacy of these people alive, we want to gather as much information about a person as possible. And census records is one of those things that are going to help us. And we all know that there are the census records that are done every 10 years. We just finished up one, and they are released to the public every 72 years. So in 2022, the 1950 census will be available to the public. We also need to understand, as we're looking at African Americans, that the first census that all African Americans were enumerated was in the 1870 census. Prior to that, only free people of color were documented. There were other schedules in the 1860s and 1870s. There was or 1850s and 60s was the slave schedules, which was a part of the federal census. These do not document the names of the people who were enslaved, but it documents the age, their sex, and how many that are on a particular place. So they're useful because if you have a name of somebody who was enslaved and you kind of know where they are, you can start to use these documents to help sort of pull together, was this the place, my family member or the person I'm researching had been enslaved. And then there are states who have state census. New York is one that does them in between the federal census. And for all of the census, there is detailed documentation of the information that was collected on each census. And so if you go to the census.gov or the National Archives, you can find information for each census and what was collected, what were the instructions that the census taker was supposed to follow. And that helps because as we look at these census, they were microfilmed in the 1930s. And so everything we're looking at, it was digitalized, is coming from what was microfilmed. And sometimes it's not very clear. So those headings at the top are a little bit difficult to read. And I find going into these documents, you can see what is in the heading and exactly what should have been collected. Now, not all census takers followed the directions. And so sometimes we will see some discrepancies there. Okay, my community resource list is very, very long of places and people and things that we can look at to find information about people. So under places, I put churches. Our churches, a lot of churches will document some milestone events in a religious life of a person, baptismals, and sometimes they will have in their death. About maybe there's information too about the funeral when it was held and the families. So our churches are possibly have a lot of information. And this is one of the areas that we all can affect because we all, as if we're a member of our churches, our religious affiliations, is to understand where is our information documented? How can, there's access to it, and to encourage these organizations to maintain these documents. I know in some of the days that have gone by in smaller rural churches, information was kept in people's homes. It really wasn't archived, and we can help a lot by encouraging that things are archived, or if we know of things or where information is, and trying to pull it to a place that is archivable. We found when my uncle passed away in my hometown, he was the trustee for the African American Cemetery, and in his belongings were books of receipts where people paid for burial spots. And thankfully, we knew how important that was to return that information to the one of the three churches that was responsible for the formation of that. But if we don't do those kind of things and we just said, oh, that's all, we throw it away, just think of what's no longer available. Libraries, another place that are filled with information. And anytime I start to search on a family and they're in a different location, I go look at that library in that location. And I know now under COVID, we're doing so much in remotely and online. I look at what kind of collections and what kind of online facilities they have. And sometimes it has been very, very fruitful. Courthouses are another place to have fun in because that's where all the legal documents are going to be related to a particular community. And we shouldn't overlook our universities. Some of the major universities and even some of the smaller ones actually have collections. People have turned in their family papers that are there. They're also the university information, the trustee minutes, registration information. Before everything went online with applications or even before paper and stuff, a lot of our universities had catalogs, and in those catalogs they list the students, they list the subjects they were taking. So those things are going to be housed in the universities. Don't overlook your businesses. Funeral homes will have funeral records of funerals that they have performed. And you want to look at both funeral homes that exist now. And when you did that research on your community, one of the things you probably found out about were funeral homes that are no longer in existence, and trying to understand where did those papers go? Because again, those are a good resource. And monument companies, like the receipt that I showed for the one in Aiken, South Carolina, even local monument companies, it's possible they've had records of purchases that were made that can help you out. Newspapers, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about newspapers. They've been invaluable in terms of for Gear Cemetery for us to find people. And city directories aren't going to tell us about burials, but they will give us some information that we'll look at in a second. Organizations, and these are just two other organizations or types of organization, or fraternal organizations. We know for the African American community, a lot of benevolent societies were formed. A lot of these fraternal organizations helped with burials, and people were involved in them, and so they help us with tracking down some of our names that we want. And don't overlook your historical societies, the local ones and the national ones. The ones that are focused, such as the Afro-American Historical and Genealogy Society, OGS, and the ones that are local to your community. For Durham, the Durham Orange County Historical Society. These societies, sometimes the members have done work to index things that are available in your community. They've collected information, and so they have this information. Plus, they can offer help with doing some of the genealogy research. Okay. So a little bit more about libraries. This is a library in Indiana where I was doing family research. And one of the things that I noticed was that they had funeral home records. So I didn't have to hunt down the funeral home. And actually the funeral home that I was interested in was the Milford Funeral Home. They actually have those records there. That funeral home is no longer in existence, and those records are in that library. The other thing that was interesting with this particular library, if you look at the list at the top, in most libraries will have a genealogy and history, or sometimes they call it research, and that's the page you want to kind of start at. But in this particular one, there was this Weaver exhibit. And because I was researching in that area, I kind of knew what Weaver was. Weaver was a free town. And people came from North Carolina, and they also came from Virginia, which is where my family was. So that was very interesting to me. And I learned a bit about Weavertown, and I learned that some of the people in that town had the surnames of my ancestors. So I wouldn't have found that had I not looked at this particular library and see what they had to offer. Again, historical societies will have family papers that could have been donated. They'll do compiled records. They have index. One in Augusta County, Virginia, one of the documents that they put together that I have shown here was the list of African American churches. It was done by an artist who sketched out churches, both churches that still exist and those that no longer exist. But the part of the gem that was in this book is those cemeteries that were associated with those churches. They documented the names of the people that they were aware of or could find that were buried within that cemetery. Newspapers. I love, next to probates and wills, I love newspapers. And I have found so much information through newspaper. And when we were doing some of the early work with Geer Cemetery, just searching newspapers helped us find people who were buried in Geer Cemetery. For example, Jim Loy, and reading his obituary in the paper, and says, okay, he was buried in the Negro Cemetery, and we know the community. We know that Geer Cemetery was one of those considered Negro cemeteries. So that gave us a hint that Jim Loy is probably in Geer Cemetery. And we were able to get his death certificate because he was born in 1915. And there he was at the very bottom, buried in Geer Cemetery. So we found quite a bit through just doing searches. Now, when I do searches, some tips about these is to, one, think about the time period. Perform some global searches. When I do searches and I'm looking at an area newspaper, you don't want to do too many newspapers at one time, but you want to start with an area newspaper, even the ones that are not African American papers. And you are going to have to think about the time, and I will search using the words colored, Black, mulatto, Negro, and even some that I don't care for, but they're all over there, such as the one that I've shown on the right, darky, and you want to look at various spellings. Not everybody was documented in the newspaper. It tended to be people that they felt some connection to, the mainstream community felt some connection to, or something unique happened to that person. But use those searches, because I found articles like this, and some of them will indicate where the people were buried with, and they add to our list. And this was especially helpful to those that were that died before the death certificates were created. Okay. Okay. Another thing is the health issues. We all are in this COVID timeframe, and it started making us think about 1918. The Spanish flu. And in the newspaper, we found lists of people who had died with the Spanish flu. There was a lot, it was just like COVID, there was just a lot of news going on. And so sometimes the newspaper actually identified the people who had deceased. Again, fraternal organizations are important. And the bottom left is a piece from a convention or proceedings from North Carolina for the Masons. And in there, it listed their members, it listed their officers, and on some of the pages, it might even listed people who died within that year. Now, we know that the Masons were a part of Geer Cemetery, and we think that they may have been one of the organizations that founded Geer Cemetery. So that gives us an idea that probably most of these people were going to be buried within Geer Cemetery. So they also, sometimes the Masons would put newspaper articles out where they're asking their fellow members to come and attend to the burial, such as they did with D.W. Sutherland. And below in the convention booklet was M.H. Christmas, and I have done some research, so I know that was Matthew Christmas. So we were able to use these lists to look at potential death certificates. And yes, he was buried in the city cemetery, which was one of the names for Gear Cemetery. Militaries and other association information is important. Again, here's my newspaper. Doing newspaper, I found Harry Robinson, a Negro who died up in Illinois as a part of the 1918. And he was buried in Gear Cemetery. And one of the things I want to point out here is his name is not correct. His name is Henry Robertson. So it took a little bit of time to make that connection, but the newspaper was not correct. But I wouldn't have known to look for a Robinson, an H. Robinson, until we found it here in the cemetery. And then just keep an eye out. We all think about our Masons, we think about the Oddfellows, we think about the Household of Ruth and so many others, that there were lots of other, sometimes local associations that were connected to a cemetery. And city directories, as I said, they won't tell us names of people buried in there. It's not but they might give us information about the cemetery. And then in this 1911 city directory, here is Gear Cemetery, just being referred to as the colored cemetery, but it gives us a name of a person who was the keeper, who happens to also be buried in Gear Cemetery. But we're able to then look at that person's life and get more information. And it's possible that there are records that are in that family. We could talk to that family about that person. They may have some oral stories and things that will help us with determining people in the cemetery. Okay. And our families, never forget our families. It's very important to involve our families in our search. They have a lot of information. One of the things that are used in a lot of African American funerals are funeral programs, which anybody that's doing genealogy, we know these are full of or gold mine for us. And a lot of them we find in our families. The families may have plot records and burial records too for their deceased members. One of the things I found in my family are family letters and obituaries that are read at the funeral. My great aunt had wrote, I have two of them, one for her father and one for her brother. And it was just, we were lucky that these things were still around when she was deceased, and we actually have copies of those. Okay, so a little bit about the Friends of Gear Cemetery process. When we started, we did have a list that was created by a previous organization. We know that that list was somewhat built on a WPA cemetery survey. So another hint here is look at your state and see if there were any type of surveying that was done. So this was done in 1930 or 1940s. And they documented all the cemeteries, and they read from the headstones that were available then. It's possible there are burial cards. They actually, from the WPA, created burial cards, but even some current burials or ones in the starting around the mid 1900s or our cemeteries created burial cards. And then of course our death certificates. We went to newspaper searches, and our Durham has a cemetery database that we are trying to get a little bit better access to, because one of the things that happened with Gear cemeteries, we know people were removed out of the cemetery and buried into what became the new African American cemetery in Durham. And so that also tells us, because there will be a burial card for when they were reburied. From this process, we started out with about 1,600 names. We are now up to 2,000 names of people buried in Gear Cemetery. Okay, so what's even more important than just gathering the names is preserving their legacies. And there's lots of ways to preserve their legacies using social media, using websites and events. We are in a technology age, and so the sky is the limit. Okay. I am going to end here so that I can allow my co-presenters to their full time. I do have a little bit more information that, if time is allowed, that I will share with you a little bit later.
Thank you, Deborah, for sharing sound tips on methodology and strategies on how we can begin to preserve our family's history and connect people to community, and to begin to create a list of names for these historic sites that we are preserving. So our next speaker is Kaylee Hoyt. Good morning, Kaylee.
Good morning. Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Deborah, for all of those fantastic tips and walking us through your process. A lot of really great information, and I share the same affinity for newspapers.com. It's an incredible resource. It's so it's invaluable for this kind of work. So I feel you on that. My name is Kaylee Hoyt. I am here representing the Black Cemetery Network, founded by Dr. Antoinette Jackson in June 2021. So relatively recent. We're still in the in what can largely be considered the experimentation phase, right? And here to just share a little bit about what the BCN does, what it is that we're really aim to do, and hopefully how we can help spread the word about some of the cemetery sites that I'm sure some of the people on this call are currently working on. I know I'm familiar with many of you through the BCN and listing your site on our website that, again, was just recently launched. So I'm just going to be talking a little bit about that. I am a graduate student at the University of South Florida's Applied Anthropology program, focusing on the role of storytelling in preserving heritage sites, as well as the role of the brain in all of that. So it's a little bit about me, as well as working as the creative director for the BCN. So I'm going to take a minute to share my screen. So it looks like, it says who can share, only host. I think if there's a swap that could happen real quick.
I think what you hit was the up arrow. So instead of hitting that little side up arrow, hit share screen right in the middle.
Oh,
And it'll open up a box for you.
got it. Perfect. All right, so hopefully everybody can see that. So let's start quickly. Here's our homepage for the website Black Cemeteries or Black History. We created a network to tell these stories, and really that's pretty much the gist, as short as we can make it. I think somebody's audio also might be on too. So Deborah, to your point about the importance of building a preservation plan that's sustainable, that community members, advocates, local government are consistently engaged with, the BCN, and one of the primary reasons I was brought on to the project, really aims to generate awareness about Black cemetery erasures on a national scale, but doing so in a way that first and foremost highlights grassroots organizations that are already working on projects, research, volunteer activities, and sites that are close to them, close to their heart, that sort of thing. And second, doing so in a way that engages visitors to the website as a resource continuously, right? To make sure it's not a one-off for people to log on to the site, log on to the archive, check it out once, never to return. And so that's really been my role as creative director in trying to think through different types of ways, different types of user engagement strategies, I guess would be the technical way to describe what it is that I'm doing, through artistic kinds of expression, as much as you can do in a virtual format, through visualization, through maps, and different ways of sharing these cemetery stories and the context behind them. So a little bit of background, our story. So our story was, the BCN was founded basically the national call to action about the issue of erasure and silencing of Black cemeteries. And this came largely out of the legislation that I'm sure you all are familiar with. And so we wanted to talk about really ways to bring together research, advocates, and in a collaborative kind of spirit, given that so many of these projects on Black cemeteries are dissociated from one another. And on various alliance calls and other advocacy group calls that I've been on, it seems to be, there seems to be a sort of large sense of agreement that yes, in fact, these projects happen on such a, what we call a local level, that rarely are they really brought into conversation with one another. And that's just in a local context here in the Tampa Bay area. We have a number of sites that have been discovered recently, and even having those talk to one another has been challenging. So it's given rise to different groups, like the African American Cemetery Alliance of Tampa Bay, for example, is one of them. And so how do you do that on a national scale, right? That's an even bigger challenge. And so that's what we designed the website for, is to serve as a resource to generate these kinds of conversations, but also act as a hub for people to go and check out the stories of these sites, which, as we know, are only hidden there and not lost. And by telling them in different formats, I think it gives another angle to the broader kind of story that we're all telling in our own ways. So again, storytelling aspect, we are a community of storytellers, essentially. Our network connects people and projects from across the country to preserve, protect, and promote Black cemetery stories, right? As well as the actual sites themselves. And Deborah, I know your presentation spoke to this, definitely. And just while we're on this page, I think I'd like to take a minute just to also acknowledge my own positionality in the context of this line of work. So my positionality basically being a fancy way of saying how is a white girl working in the anthropology department at USF all of a sudden the creative director of the Black Cemetery Network? It's a question that is posed quite often, and understandably so. And so I just want to acknowledge that in sharing a little bit about my story that brought me in to this work. Originally, first off is Dr. Antoinette Jackson. I've been a fan of her work for a number of years. And so working with her directly, that was immediately inspired my role in the BCN. Secondly, we are also working on a project called the African American Burial Ground Project on cemetery sites in St. Pete that have been, whose stories have recently been uncovered, and which on sites that Ned Tropicana Field for the Tampa Bay Rays now occupies. And so in the process of doing, Deborah, you just spoke about newspapers.com and the genealogical research and all that background, in doing throughout that kind of process and thinking about, okay, I'm also interested in creative expression and art forms and different ways of opening up different access points for people to relate to these stories beyond just reading them. That's really how I got involved. So I think that's just important to acknowledge on the front end. So the archive is a very significant part of what it is that we're doing. Again, a number of people on the call have registered their sites, so we thank you for that. We are now up to 28 sites, which is very exciting because we started with the 3 that were basically been worked on for the African American Burial Ground Project itself. So the BCN Archive, like it says, is a comprehensive directory of African American cemetery sites that we're able to create site pins for and upload to our map. So there's really no point in me trying to explain it. So I think I will just go here. I might have to reshare my screen. We'll see if this works. Are y'all able to see that? Thumbs up, thumbs down? No? Okay. I'll redo this. That should work. All right, so you see down here the archive, explore the archive. You scroll down here, we've got our map. Hopefully, those that have seen this map prior to today will recognize that the map is much bigger. We have many more pins, so it's very exciting. It allows people to visit the site, click on different pins to see where exactly the sites are. The idea being that basically if you are located in St. Petersburg, Florida, and you want to know more about sites in your particular area, or you're on a road trip and you are going through a specific area and have an interest in visiting Black cemetery sites, then you can go and check out cemeteries listed in the parameter. You can also use the filter option that we have. So that's what that looks like. We provide a brief history of the site that you're working on, as well as any kind of affiliations. When the site was founded, the location, images, all that you see in this little site brief here. You can also click on an expanded version that gives you more information in a different layout to explore. So that should give you some sense. And relative to the storytelling aspect of what the site really aims to do, our interactive site gallery really came as a product of playing around with coding, which I know nothing about, and plugging in a code into Squarespace and having the ability to flip over magically by some miracle these tiles, which I thought would only really be satisfying to just me. And as it turns out, there are many fans of the site gallery and the ability to flip these little tiles over. I don't know, some sort of sensory brain thing happening there, I'm not sure. But what we've done is basically assign different quotes to each tile. And although the instructions are not posted on the above, I think probably I sort of liked the fact that it was a little bit secretive, that you really had to engage with the site to be able to figure this out. I think I'll actually have to instruct people to click on the back of the tiles. There you go. And we have different stories. Are they about Black cemetery sites? No, they are not. But what they are about are different forms of expressing things like Black radical joy, the work of Derek Adams, Hiplet, which is this fantastic fusion ballet group. Laurel Cemetery, here we have Derek Adams' work. He was just in St. Petersburg recently with his Floater series, and more work basically to connect the stories that we're all sharing in some way about people who are deceased, but whose memories we are still actively working to reactivate, to re-energize, marrying those conversations with work that is ongoing. and does so in a way that is creative and expressive and that works more through feeling and emotional kinds of resonance than it does on literal connections. And so that's sort of the idea behind the site gallery and just some of my role as a creative director of the BCN. So hopefully that gives you some idea as to what it is that I do, what it is that the BCN really is focused on doing. And if you'd like to register our site, there's a link here that you're able to submit. It's a simple Google form. You provide all of the information, where your site's located, the history, any kind of content that you'd like us to attach to your map pin and site brief. We're more than happy to do that. We'll compile, use all of that information to create that pin and upload it, as well as invite you to our member community, which is another aim for this network, is to really bring members together and generate these kinds of conversations through our member network and through our member portal. So you'll get all of that login information as well when you register your site. I think I've got one more slide here. So ending with some good trouble, and a shout out to Dr. Jackson for ensuring that the good trouble is, originally I had on here for bringing, will be bringing the good trouble. It was like, what are you talking about? The good trouble has been brought to Tallahassee, to the Capitol. Just really exciting work that Dr. Jackson is doing. She was recently appointed to officially to the Task Force on Abandoned African American Cemeteries. It is a task force in the state of Florida, representing the Florida Council of Churches, which is like, how much more applied can applied anthropology be, right? So again, just wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Jackson and a hashtag Cite Black Women, because got to. So that is all I have. And I'll turn it back over to Mona.
Thank you, Kaylee. It was awesome, awesome presentation. Thank you for sharing your story of inspiration and how you have chosen to use your gift of creative expression to bring awareness, to help bring awareness to so many stories and these historic sites. So our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Thaler. Welcome.
Thank you, Mona. And thank you also to Kaylee and Deborah for all the great information you've shared today. So let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. If you can't, feel free to interrupt me at any point. So I come to the topic of documenting and studying historic cemeteries from an archaeological perspective, and more specifically through some of the teaching I've been doing recently. This semester, I've been teaching a course at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, called The Archaeology of Durham, which thinks about how to tell the story of the city and its communities, not through major political events, but instead by looking at its material culture. So its artifacts, monuments, art, architecture, and historic sites. The idea is that by focusing on material culture, we might be able to recover aspects of daily life and cultural practices that are not traditionally captured in written historical sources. So because this course was centered on material culture, I thought it would be a great opportunity to plan a major course assignment around the study of cemeteries in Durham. So for their final project, my students would collect data about cemeteries in Durham and then ask, what can these headstones and grave markers teach us about the people that lived here in the past. So in my presentation today, I want to cover 3 basic things related to documenting and digitizing cemeteries. First, planning the survey of grave markers and collecting the data. Then how we turned that data into an interactive digital map, and then how collecting this data and mapping it can help us answer questions about the past. So for some quick background and context, here's a map of Durham, North Carolina, with the location of Duke University labeled. My students visited 2 cemeteries this semester. One was Geer Cemetery, which we've already heard a lot about from Deborah, and you can see highlighted here in the northeast corner. And then the second was Maplewood Cemetery in the south. And because Maplewood Cemetery is gigantic, we only surveyed a very small section of it, which I've outlined here on the map. So I chose these 2 specific cemeteries for particular reasons. One is they are roughly contemporary. Maplewood was established in 1872 and Geer was established in 1876. So I thought collecting data on both would produce an especially interesting comparison. Second, Maplewood was originally reserved for Durham's white community and Geer served the Black community at the same time. So doing this meant that looking at these 2 cemeteries allowed my students to address issues of race in their research. So these are the 2 sites we decided to survey. And when I say survey, I am basically referring to a type of above ground archaeology. So rather than gaining information through digging and excavation, we were collecting data about the grave markers already visible at these sites. Surveys are meant to be a non-destructive means of investigation. So what data did we decide to collect? Figuring this out is the part of the survey planning that took the longest. I met with Deborah, who we heard from Friends of Geer Cemetery, to discuss what her group might be interested in recording. And together we reviewed forms that other cemetery surveys had used. I consulted with Melissa Timo from the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. I did my own research on how other archaeologists document grave markers. And I also had a lot of conversations with my students in class about what types of information we would want to record. So in the end, we came up with several different questions that we would ask about each grave marker we surveyed. The first 4, name, date, inscription, and family relationships, are fairly straightforward. This is the information that you get basically by just reading the text on a headstone. But we were also thinking about attributes of the grave marker itself. So its symbols and decoration, its material, the shape, the size, the orientation of the grave, its location within the cemetery, and any objects that may happen to be placed around the grave marker, and finally its condition and preservation. So once we established our survey questions, I used Survey 123, which is an ArcGIS program, to create a survey form that students could access on their phones. So when we were out visiting cemeteries, each student would go to a grave marker, pull up the form on their phones, and then begin answering questions about their grave marker. To make things easier, these forms allowed for multiple choice options, checkboxes, and calendar dates. Students could also attach photographs of the grave markers, and the form would capture the phone's current location, which we would need later on to make our map. I teach first-year college students with no background in archaeology or any type of cemetery studies. So one concern was, how could we ensure that the data they collected would be accurate and reliable? To address this issue, we practiced using the form together in class several times before we actually visited the cemeteries. And I also provided these reference handouts for the students on site, which would help them identify different materials, different symbols, different types of grave markers. So they could use these handouts as a reference while they were filling out their forms. And of course, I was also with them on site to help answer any questions they might have. So here are a few photographs where you can see the students surveying the grave markers at Geer Cemetery and Maplewood Cemetery. They're using their phones to fill out the forms. They're taking measurements. They're taking photographs. So what happens to all this data after they collect it? All the information they gather visually or individually is automatically brought together in a spreadsheet that looks something like this. So this is very dense and there's a lot of information here. But one of the goals of our project was to make the data we collected, especially for Geer Cemetery, as accessible as possible. So this probably is not the most engaging way to explore a cemetery. So for something that's a little more accessible and visually appealing, I used ArcGIS Online to make a map, an interactive digital map. And I want to show you what the map looks like. So give me a second to reshare my screen. Okay, so hopefully this map is visible. And if it's not, please interrupt me. So the first thing you notice is that in the center of the screen, we have this map. And this is the map we made just showing Geer Cemetery. And so you notice we have all these different points. Each of these points, each of these circles represents a grave marker that one of my students surveyed. So if we click on a specific point, it should bring up a pop-up window that shows all the data they collected. So you can see we have the name of the individual, we have the photograph that my student took of this grave marker. If you scroll down, you can see date of birth, date of death, their age, their gender, what the shape of the marker was. So this one is a tablet. You can see the material, this one's limestone. They tracked its condition, the types of symbols that appear on the grave marker. So this one has a cross and crown symbol and also some leaves. They recorded the entire inscription that was written on the marker. They took measurements, so you can see the height, the width, thickness, the orientation of the grave. So this one is pointed west. And then, yeah, so then my student, Ayana, recorded her name at the bottom of this point. So this is a lot of really rich data, and every single point you see has this level of information for all the individuals that have grave markers at the site. So besides viewing everything as just circles, there are also other ways to visualize the data my students collected. So in this upper right corner, you can see we have the option to turn on and off different layers. So if we turn off this layer and turn on a layer called marker form, and we go to the map legend on the right, you can see that now the dots are displayed based on what the shape of the grave marker is, because that's something we were paying attention to. So you can see right away that most of the markers at Geer Cemetery are tablets. But if we zoom in, you can also see that there are different pedestal markers. So if we click one, we can see what those look like. And then in the northern part of the cemetery, we have a few obelisks, which is represented by this symbol. So you can click on an obelisk, see what that looks like. Besides looking at the form, we can turn off this layer, and we can also look at the height of the marker. So here we can see that the larger the circle, the taller the marker is. And just viewing the map this way, you might be able to start detecting some patterns. So it seems like the taller markers are placed in positions that are closer to the surrounding streets or along the pathways within the cemetery. So it seems like the taller, more prominent markers were given spaces that were more visible in the cemetery, while the smaller markers are sort of located in the interior, less visible spaces. So besides viewing these points in different ways, on the left side of the screen over here, we also have a number of different filters that we can use to interact with the data in even more ways. So the first thing we can do is we can search for a name of an individual. So if we search for the name Gussie Sheeran, the map should zoom in, showing us exactly where this individual is buried. And then on the right side, we can see Gussie Sheeran's gravestone, and also scroll down to look at more pictures and all the information the student recorded about this specific individual. Besides that, we also have this timeline slider. So if we adjust the sliding scale here, we can look at how the cemetery sort of grew and developed over time as it began to fill out the spaces of the land it now occupies. Besides that, we can look at the form of the marker. So again, if we just want to see the pedestals, we click pedestal, and then it filters out everything that isn't a pedestal. And on the upper right side of the screen, you can scroll through to see, what all these different grave markers look like. We also paid attention to material. So if you just want to see the granite markers, click granite. These are the granite ones we have. Again, the right side adjusts. And then if you want to look at slate, you can see we only have 4 slate markers, and they're sort of all concentrated in this one particular part of the cemetery, interestingly. So besides those filters, we also in the lower right side have graphs that let us interact with this data in even more ways. So this is a graph showing the different materials. You can see that marble is by far the most popular, followed by concrete. And these graphs on the right side are also interactive. So they change depending on what's being displayed on the map. So for example, on the left side, we can scroll down. If we want to search for a specific symbol, let's say anchors. Anchors are the most popular symbol at Geer Cemetery. So this will show us all of the different grave markers that have an anchor symbol. And you can see the graph on the right side has adjusted, showing us that there are 19 concrete markers with anchors and 2 marble ones. So if we just want to see the marble ones, we can click on this bar, and then we'll just highlight the marble gravestones with anchors, and we can scroll through them over here. In addition to the material, we can also view the different types of marker forms. So you can see tablets are by far the most popular. We can look at the year of death. So you can see that the cemetery sort of peaks around the 1920s and then starts to decline closer to the time when it was shut down by the health department. And we can also look at the age of individuals. So, noticing at what points in their lives people are passing away. And this also changes in interesting ways based on whether we're looking at men or women. So these are just a number of different ways we can explore all the data that the students collected. I mentioned that the students were collecting data about 2 cemeteries so that we could compare them. And I'll just quickly show one other map we made showing both side by side. Hopefully this comes up. Okay, good. So you can see we have Maplewood Cemetery on the left and Geer Cemetery again on the right. And we have the same kinds of filters we had before. So we can look again at material. So if we just want to look at, let's say, granite, right? So we have a lot of granite markers at Maplewood, but not that many at Geer Cemetery. However, if we look for concrete, we'll notice that concrete's very popular at Geer Cemetery, but we don't have a single concrete marker at Maplewood. We can do the same search for symbols. So if we're again looking for anchors, anchors. We can see that, again, anchors are the most popular symbol at Geer Cemetery, but there's no examples of anchors in the part of Maplewood that we surveyed. So in designing these maps and dashboards, it was important for me to make them as intuitive and accessible and interactive as possible, because we wanted to share our information with friends of Geer Cemetery ultimately, and invite others to look at these sites and start thinking about them like archaeologists. So these maps are, they exist as websites now that anybody can explore. So to conclude, I will return to my presentation quickly. Okay, hopefully we're back in my PowerPoint. So all these different ways of visualizing and exploring the data start to raise some questions, right? We collected all this data. What have we actually learned about these communities? And so while it's great that we can learn about specific individuals' names, their ages, their families, doing a full archaeological survey that also pays attention to the grave markers themselves allows us to address questions that pertain to the whole community and beyond. So this is what my students are currently working on in their research papers right now. Some of my students are looking at the different symbols on the grave markers and the inscriptions and thinking about what they tell us about religious beliefs and attitudes towards death. Do these attitudes change over time? Are there differences between Durham's Black and white communities, or perhaps differences within these communities? Other students are thinking about gender identity. What are the types of words that are used to describe women on the gravestones, and how do those compare to men? Others are comparing the mortality rates between the white and Black communities. They're doing research on access to healthcare, studying death certificates to identify different causes of death. Do women who die in childbirth have specific symbols on their grave markers? Are there certain types of markers used for men who may have died in war? Others are exploring how wealth and status are expressed in the Black and white communities. We might assume that concrete markers are probably a cheaper alternative to marble or granite. But I think it's interesting that some of the concrete markers also have traces of white paint on them. So perhaps back when the paint was fully preserved, many of the concrete markers originally would have looked like marble. So how does decoration play into this? Did more prominent individuals have taller grave markers? Or perhaps wealthy families didn't want ostentatious markers and instead favored simpler, more modest headstones. So the relationship between grave marker and status might not be so straightforward. So these are just a few of the questions that doing an archaeological survey of a cemetery allow us to answer. So to conclude, even though making a digital map like we did looks complicated, I'm certain that you do not need a PhD in archaeology to do what we did this semester. In fact, I myself had no idea how to collect and map this data up until a couple of months ago. So I think it's more accessible than it might seem. I mentioned the specific programs that we used for the map and survey. I'm lucky that I can access these through Duke, but there were other options available that I listed here that may be cheaper or more widely accessible. Deborah and I were originally playing around with using Google Forms or Airtable when we were first planning the survey. And you can also avoid computers completely and print out survey forms and fill them out by hand on site, that you'd probably want to digitize them afterwards. I also think doing an archaeological survey like this is a great opportunity for collaboration and community engagement. Anybody can participate and collect this data with just maybe an hour or two of practice. Certain things like identifying different types of stones may require the help of a local archaeologist or geologist, but even that can be practiced and learned fairly quickly if you're focusing on a specific cemetery. The more people you have participating, the more you can accomplish. I teach 30 students this semester. Each one had to record 10 gravestones. So in 90 minutes, we had completed the first archaeological survey of Geer Cemetery. I also think there were opportunities for conversations and collaborations between cemeteries. So while every cemetery probably has its own specific needs, I wonder if it would be possible for different local groups to come together and develop a standardized survey form. And I wonder also if the Black Cemetery Network could be a way to get these conversations started. That way, interesting comparisons could be made across and between cemeteries. And this would open up all kinds of possibilities for research and learning about underrepresented communities and cultures on a huge scale. And I'll just end by saying, one of the reasons I like teaching archaeology is that I get students who in other classes or in previous classes, maybe they learn how to analyze a poem or know how to interpret numbers in a graph. But most of us aren't really taught how to think critically about the physical material world around us, which we usually just take for granted in our daily lives. So archaeology makes us think about these things. In performing the survey, each student had to spend about 10 minutes with each grave marker, observing it carefully, thinking about its material, its shape, its location, reading the names of the individuals and their epitaphs. And so I think an archaeological survey is valuable simply because it forces us to look closely at things that maybe haven't received much attention in a very long time. Great. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. That was an amazing presentation. And thank you so much for sharing information on how we can truly transform our preservation approach when it comes to these historic sites, and how we can engage our youth and through the use of archaeological techniques and technology, we can collect information and data with regards to material culture, artifacts, cultural practices, and surveying grave markers, and how we can integrate all of this information into a digital mapping that can be interactive for the community. So thank you so much again. With that being said, I think our moderator, Celeste Keith, has been taking notes on the comments and questions that have been posted in the chat box.
Hi, first I would like to say your presentations were amazing. I learned a lot, and it's just so helpful for someone like me who wants to go into this industry. So thank you three for your very informative presentation. So the first question we have is, how would we construct a needs survey designed to elicit 100% participation on the local level and gain trust for collaborative purposes?
Would anyone like to take that question?
I'll start and take a stab at it. And I'm struggling a little bit because I want to make sure I understand what needs survey exactly means. But with starting this work, because part of the question is dealing with the collaboration and gaining trust, is that is a major step in this work for any organization that's being created, and it does take some time. And with Gear Cemetery, some of the things we did were to hold some events very early on and just sort of get our name out there and what our mission was, and to have events even like this online, and the partnerships that we have formed with our area universities, Duke University being one, have been invaluable. We have other universities in the area that we've worked with, and that has helped a lot. We recently, the spring or winter spring, had an outdoor exhibit that brought in our community, where we put 10 panels on the carriage trail. And I think that was part of, it generated a lot of conversation within our community, and it helped us to get recognized and to build some of that trust. Because from that, we have received quite a few donations. We've received people who want to volunteer. So I think engaging the community. Now, we also try to engage our descendant community. And that's a little different, because as a genealogist, when we've had some events and we've discovered the genealogy and we reach out to descendants, sometimes it takes a while to build that trust too. And by being visible, that really helped. For example, the very first event we had, where we had reset a headstone, we reached out to family members after research. We didn't get responses, but the newspaper media was there, and with the coverage, the next day our phones were ringing from the very people we were trying so hard to connect with. So it starts slow, but just kind of, just to stay at it. I don't know when we will reach 100%, but we want to work towards that goal.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists want to answer this question?
I can go for it. Just tacking on to what Deborah said. So I think first and foremost, 100% participation can be just a little bit problematic, only because it suggests that on the front end of the project, you know exactly what 100% is, right? You know exactly the community members, the people involved that are not only involved in this project, but they care about whatever the site is that you're working on. But I do think that, Deborah, you mentioned the event that you hosted. I think doing actively doing outreach, being transparent in what it is that you're about, and what it is that the approach that you're taking, the people that are involved in the project, the voices that the project represents, and making sure that the community members are as informed as you can make them. So posting, things like op-eds in the paper are really helpful. Social media, Facebook groups, raising awareness, and also being mindful of sort of on the ground places that you can use to increase awareness of these kinds of projects. So printing out a brochure that has all of the information about the site and the people involved and the contact information and everything like that, and then going to local churches and making sure that those are distributed there. Going to community centers, going to places that don't just rely on virtual formats to make sure that the community is informed and they have the opportunity to participate as well.
Thank you. The next question is, what's the significance of the anchors on the gravestone?
I don't know. The research that was done by Andrew and his class, we haven't. It's fairly new. It's within the last month, and we're still digesting. We're just still over the head of that particular GS mapping system and being able to look at this data, and we haven't looked at it of some of these symbols, exactly what they mean.
And I'll just add that a few of my students have also noticed how popular the anchors are and are asking that question about why they're so significant. And as someone put it in the chat just now, thank you for adding this. There is a Bible verse about that mentions an anchor. So an anchor is usually considered a symbol of hope. And so my students are thinking about, why is this symbol in particular so popular in Durham during this period? And so they're thinking about sort of bigger things that are happening in the community. So Durham in the early 20th century was it's sort of considered the golden age in a way of sort of the Black community's history in this area. We have Black Wall Street, we have the thriving Hayti neighborhood with a really prosperous Black community and hundreds of businesses. So it may be that this period in the early 20th century was considered a time of hope and optimism for this community. And we could see that reflected in some of the iconography and symbols used in the grave markers. So that's something my students are thinking about in their research.
Thank you. What is the biggest piece of advice you guys would give to someone going into this work?
Stay steady on the course. Start slow. It's easy to want to just jump in and do, but also and educate yourself. Surround yourself with like-minded. And there's been several times I've wanted to say that. And one of the first things I did when I was going to look into this was I started contacting other groups, and they were very opening. And one of them had a chat in there. It was Oberlin Village out of Raleigh, and we know there's a connection between Geer Cemetery and Oberlin. The two with their members that have crossed over into the two communities, and just creating that network, because we help each other and we learn from each other. Yeah, and I think, and Kaylee mentioned that too, in terms of what Dr. Jackson is doing down in Florida, is that we have all these pieces and we're not always talking together, but the more we talk together, the more we can help, the more we can reduce duplication and support and create support.
Thank you. What do you find to be the biggest challenge in your line of work?
Having enough time. If I could multiply myself a couple times. That would be helpful. And not trying to make light of, there are challenges. There are challenges we have self-inflicted. There are challenges sometimes the community has given us. And that's part of when I stated about it's important to set your mission and goals early. That helps with some things so that everybody is marching to the same beat, and we understand where we're going to go as a group, and we're not in the middle of something and then all of a sudden we realize we're going in different ways. But also engaging everybody in a way they want to be engaged. One of the things we found with Gear Cemetery is writing those stories and making those stories available, sharing those stories of the people within the cemetery creates a lot of interest, and it draws the community in with that, and it helps us to start to draw in our descendants. And I don't remember if it was Kaylee or Andrew mentioned, we've got all this different technology to use. Our Facebook, we do a day of honor post if we know the birth date of a person. We research, we put that on our Facebook page. We are in the process of building a website, and we have another Kaylee on our team too, who is putting together a type of mapping system, not a visual mapping system, but a way that a user can address the database and look up people who are buried in the cemetery and gather some information. I kind of see us eventually maybe merging that in with some of the work that Andrew has done, so we don't have two different interfaces. But look at technology and look at what works for you and start where you can. As Andrew said, there's tons of technology out there, and it can be intimidating, but start with what you know. We started with using Google Drive to maintain our information. We created folders for each person on a Google Drive, and we use a spreadsheet to control who is working on which person, so that we have some kind of control mechanism. But start where you are, and then work from it, and you build those partnerships to develop more. We have these great databases now that and people who know how to create them.
Thank you. I'm gonna pass it to Mona as the homecoming crowd is getting loud outside of my.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Celeste. And again, thank you to each of our speakers today. What a wealth of knowledge we all have gained by your presentations. I am just in awe. And thank you again to each of the participants that joined us today. My takeaways, I have so many, but I'll just name a few because I know our time is almost out. So as preservationists, we are storytellers, and that community has the capacity to become cultural stewards through creative expression, and that we can elevate our preservation experience and have a transformative approach by including the archaeological techniques that were presented today. So again, I just want to say thank you again so much to each of you for speaking to us today on how to preserve family history, how to strengthen community, and how to expand our skill set and practical knowledge when it comes to digitizing historic African-American cemeteries. Again, this event has been hosted by the Hamilton Hood Foundation, and thank you to our donors in helping us to host this event. You can reach us via email at hamiltonhood.org. If you have any further questions or comments, please visit our website at hamiltonhood.org. Thank you again to each of our speakers. This has been wonderful, and we hope that you will join us again for another presentation. And thank you again to each of our participants.